Okay. Hi, it's Gabrielle, and I'm super excited because today I have a special guest, and I'm really happy to have him on the show. His name's Peter Fabish, and he is a collaborative divorce attorney, and he's going to be talking to us all about collaborative divorce and mediation. Peter, I'm so glad to have the opportunity to speak with you today.
Thank you, Gabrielle. I'm really honored and happy to be here. I appreciate you asking me to do the interview.
Yeah, for sure. So I want to just let our viewers know a little bit about who you are. Peter has been a practicing attorney since 1991, and later in his career, he became a family law attorney. So, along with his colleague, John Hawley, he is the co founder of Conscious Family Law and Mediation, where he guides couples through the collaborative divorce process. He's also a trained psychotherapist and co author with John Hawley of The Collaborative Divorce Advantage. So, what I'd like to do is just I'm hoping to give our viewers sort of a general idea, an overview of what collaborative divorce is all about, how mediation plays into that. I know that it's a very different kind of process than what most people think of when they think of the word divorce. So, maybe we could just start with you kind of giving us an idea of what collaborative divorce is and how it differs from regular divorce.
Mm. Sure, it's a great question, Gabrielle, and I appreciate that it's new territory for many people, including just the prospect of going through divorce at all, which I think by any account is a truly terrifying prospect for many people, for a lot of reasons. The financial fear of it, the fear of being in conflict, particularly with someone whom one has been very close and intimate over time,
Hmm.
the fear of what could happen to one's children and family, being judged. So there's many things that are scary about divorce, and collaborative divorce is a way of approaching this very challenging transition in a way that can be much more under the control of the participants and much less sort of out of control heading into conflict. So, um, in divorce, there's certainly issues that need to be resolved, and sometimes there's quite a bit of disagreement between spouses as to how to resolve those issues. And in a traditional divorce, people typically each hire a lawyer, both spouses, and they file a divorce, and then the lawyers largely control the process. They file the complaints, they issue discovery, which is written questions and demands for information and documents. They push the issues, and they do much of the negotiation around how things will be resolved. And if the lawyers aren't able to resolve the issues between themselves, in collaboration with the clients, typically, of course, the lawyers aren't just completely free actors. They end up going into a court and going in front of a judge, and then they have a trial, which is it's a staged battle of who has the better positions on things, and a third party, I like to call a stranger in a robe. The judge is a stranger to these people. Decide for people how their divorce is going to look, what their family, their parenting plan is going to look like, what their situation with their children is going to be like, and how they're going to divide their property. In collaborative divorce, the parties take control. They put themselves in the position of being the negotiators, with the help, in our case, through conscious family law, of a trained lawyer mediator who can help them to understand what the issues are, what the process is, take them through it, but then helps them to have the conversations that they need to have in order to come to their own conclusions about how their divorce should look. And as you can hear from that, there's many advantages around not giving up control, not giving up sovereignty of how your divorce should look to a judge, and also to lawyers who are really trained to be in conflict, to taking that back to the couple themselves and letting them make the decisions. On the difficult side, it does require the couple themselves to engage in these negotiations. And I think that's part of the challenge people face because they fear to have these conversations. They're very difficult conversations sometimes. And that's where the mediator comes in to be a facilitator, to be a neutral go-between between the people and to help them to have these conversations in a productive way.
Hmm. Hmm. So I imagine that there's something actually quite empowering in a certain way, as difficult as that could be to be have to have those conversations yourself. But the fact that you have that control over the process at a time in your life when you actually are experiencing a loss of control, really, with the dissolution of your marriage and um, everything, it's like your whole world is upside down. So that's I imagine in a way it's gratifying to be able to take the process into your own hands.
Indeed, yes, absolutely. And the people that come to us are people that want to, they come to us for a lot of reasons, that being one of them, that they don't want to give over total control of a very personal and crucial situation involving their livelihood, their children, to lawyers and judges. I should say that in collaborative divorce, it's not that lawyers, individual lawyers who represent the parties, cannot be involved. People often do have lawyers that they're talking to. Usually in our process, the lawyers aren't present during the negotiations, but they can be. But quite often people will have a lawyer in the background, helping them answer questions that they don't, getting additional help from that in addition to what I provide them as the mediator.
I see. So can you take us sort of through what a typical um, family mediation process would look like? Just let's say you want to get divorced, and where do you start? What's the first thing, and then thereafter?
Sure. We usually typically start out by having a call. If you're doing it through our firm, I'll talk about how it looks through our firm, and there are some differences in the way other people do it, but
Hmm.
this is somewhat typical. You would speak to our client services coordinators who would give the client who's interested in it some basic information about what the process looks like and to find out whether or not this particular couple is appropriate for mediation. And I can talk about that at some point if you'd like, as well
Absolutely.
as some of the ways we screen for that. And if it looks like it is something that's appropriate for them and that they're interested in, they would set them up with an initial consultation with myself or John or one of the other mediators in the firm. In the initial consultation, we would go through with the couple together and have them describe what their situation is, get some basic information about what the issues would be in their divorce, make sure that it sounds like they are an appropriate couple again for divorce, just a second level of screening for collaborative divorce. And then once they've made the decision to go forward with it, they would hire our firm. They would pay something called a retainer, which is amount of money they put down, which goes as just a payment of their bills as they come up. And then they start by doing, this is a little dry, but they go through the financial disclosure process. This is something that every couple has to do in a divorce, whether it's collaborative or not. In the collaborative case, we just have them upload their financial documents to a secure server. And those are just all of the pieces of financial information that are needed to be disclosed in order to have a division of property. So any accounts that they have, any retirement accounts, any investment accounts, any bank accounts, those statements all get uploaded. If there's a mortgage on a house, the mortgage statement gets uploaded. All of those financial disclosures get done. Then we take those, put them into a spreadsheet that just gives a one-page layout of all the property that's at issue. And then we schedule mediations. And the mediations there's two parts to any divorce that we talk about typically in separate mediations. One of which is how is the property going to be divided? Who's going to get the house? Are they going to sell the house and split the equity? Who's going to get the various, how are they going to divide the marital property? Is there property that's considered separate property, which is property that perhaps came into the marriage prior to the marriage and was kept separate, or perhaps property that was inherited? That property goes to the person who owns it. It doesn't get divided equitably. Then we go through it in the mediation itself. We go through a discussion of an equitable division of property, and the mediator's role in that situation is not just simply to be a neutral facilitator of a conversation, but also to ensure that the process is fair, that both parties really understand what the law says, what their rights are, what an equitable division might look like. And again, people have a lot of their own sovereignty around that, but still, it's good to have an understanding of how a court might look at it if they were in court as opposed to negotiating on their own. And we guide them through that process of saying, how do we do this? And sometimes it can be quite complicated. If a party, for example, one party wants to keep the house, well, how do we determine how much goes to the other person in equity, and then how does that get balanced out in other parts of the estate? So we go through that process. The other piece of the financial division is there going to be spousal support? This used to be referred to as alimony, and in Colorado it's now called maintenance. Determine, is there going to be maintenance payments, and if so, how much? And there's formulas that the statutes provide for that, in addition to a number of factors. There's a 7-factor analysis that people go through. And then the other major piece of it is the parenting plan. And the parenting plan is how do they make, did you need a...
Oh, there's just that on that last point about the maintenance and how that is determined. I think one of the questions that a lot of couples have, who I've spoken to, is they have this idea that there aren't any kind of general rules about how property is going to get divided, and so they're very afraid that they're going to be taken advantage of, and so they're not aware that, oh, no, actually the state has certain laws about how this happens that protect people from
Yes.
being taken to the cleaners. And that I've just noticed that seems to be a very relieving message for a lot of people.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I appreciate you raising that, Gabrielle, and it is crucial because we do find a lot of people come to us with a lot of fear around, well, particularly if they're not hiring a lawyer to represent them through the process, will they be taken advantage of? Will they, as you say, be taken to the cleaners and end up in a really financially untenable position when it's all over? And you're right, there are laws around this, and divorce is an equitable process, and the laws are built around equity. And so if you're in a divorce and a collaborative process with a mediator like one here, and I do strongly recommend that whether you use Conscious Family or any other mediator, you make sure that that mediator is someone who's very knowledgeable about these rules and these laws. That's why all of our mediators at Conscious Family are actually practicing licensed family lawyers in addition to being mediators, because we know the rules, and they can be somewhat complex and difficult to apply. But in the end, yes, there's a lot of protection for people to not get taken to the cleaners, and to not, because the law wants, it's a no fault process. So we're not sitting in the mediations talking about whose fault was it that the divorce is happening. Nor would a court be looking at that. That's not part of the equitable process, although it certainly rests in equitable consideration within the parties quite often. They do have, and quite understandably, I don't denigrate people's feelings about fault and blame and things like that. But when it comes to the actual division of property and parenting plan, well, the parenting plan is a little different. I can talk about that in a second. But division of property, there's equitable rules that apply. And part of my job as a mediator is to make sure that the process goes equitably, that neither party is dominated by the other, that they don't come away with a deal that just won't pass muster. And the other piece of that that's important to know, Gabrielle, is courts, even when it's an agreed division, the courts still review them for equity. And if the division were to come out seemingly really imbalanced, which doesn't really happen in our process because we oversee that, but the courts will ask the parties, well, why is this? And they may not approve it if they don't get a good answer.
Wow. Okay. That's really good to know. Yeah. So I know we want to move on and talk about the parenting plan. I have one question about what you said. I think another really important issue is this idea of no fault divorce.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe you could say something about that because I think a lot of people imagine that if the reason they're getting divorced is because, let's say, one person had an affair or one person committed some kind of egregious betrayal, that that is going to be somehow reflected in the divorce itself, in terms of how much, how the property gets divided or what happens to the kids. So maybe you could just say a little bit more about that. And also, I know there's some history about that because I think at one point that actually was somehow a factor.
Yeah. Yeah, good. It's a good question, Gabrielle. There is a history to that, and for many years in divorce in America, and as it was in most other Western cultures, was fault based. You had to sue for divorce, and you had to have a reason for divorce. And so, if there was an affair, that would be one of the reason for divorce. And you really had, as you can imagine, that process playing out in a courtroom was truly horrific. You'd have parties just arguing in front of the court as to who was the more horrible person, um, and and then the court would make a decision about that. And fortunately, decades ago, virtually every state in the United States, including Colorado, passed laws making divorce non-fault, no fault. So that's no longer a question as to why the divorce is happening. You don't have to have a reason for it other than that the marriage is irretrievably broken. And you can just make that as an allegation, and that's not something that's explored. It's just a decision that either party can make, or the two parties can make together.
Hmm.
And so we're not debating whether or not one party betrayed the other, or so how. The only way that could any of those issues could possibly come into play is if they somehow reflected on uh, a person's ability to be a good parent, and that almost never is the case. A court's not going to say, well, because someone had an affair, they're not capable of parenting properly.
Right.
So it really doesn't come in to play. A court could potentially say, well, if someone has a drug or alcohol abuse problem that they're not addressing and they're not getting treatment for, that could potentially impact a person's capability as a parent, and that could come into play in a parenting arrangement. We can talk about that.
Yeah. Yeah. We can move into that if you'd like to. Hmm.
Sure. So you want me to just go ahead and talk about parenting plans then, and then.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think a lot of people have questions about what a parenting plan is. And I know that a lot of couples that I've spoken to didn't know that there was such a thing as a parenting plan, um, and have even gone through divorce with children without a parenting plan. If they went through the divorce themselves, if they did the divorce with no legal representation.
Mm.
So anyway, I think it's a very important thing to discuss. So let's get into it.
Yes, absolutely. So the parenting plan, and that's, I'll just refer back again to the fears people show up with. Probably the biggest fear I see people showing up with is fear that somehow their their relationship with their children will be taken away from them. That they'll be somehow unable to continue to parent their children, and that's almost never the case. What the courts, what a parenting plan is is a court order. And if you're going through collaborative divorce, you reach an agreement on it, and then it is submitted to the court, and the court turns it into an order, an enforceable order that establishes first decision making. So, and most often, unless you have a couple where one parent is truly unfit to make decisions for the children, you will have joint decision making over major decisions going forward, which is one of the reasons why collaborative divorce is so much better way to go than traditional divorce, because one of the things we always want people to keep in mind is, yes, you are ending your relationship as a married couple, but your relationship as co-parents is going to go on for the rest of your life.
Hmm.
And most, especially while your children are still in the age of minority. And so if you go through a process in which you've completely destroyed your relationship through battle in court, being co-parents can be very challenging going forward. And the people that I'm most concerned in that situation are the ones that aren't in the courtroom and aren't in the mediation room, and that's the children.
Yeah.
Because if what the studies consistently show is that children can come through divorce and can thrive after divorce. But what really determines a poor outcome for children is conflict between parents, and particularly if that conflict continues after the divorce. And so there's a lot at stake in doing the divorce well. And if you're thinking about your children, which almost all parents are the center of their thinking, you really want to think about going through your divorce in a way that doesn't destroy your relationship with your co-parent. Because the other piece of it is that the studies show and the courts acknowledge that children maintaining good, healthy relationships with both parents after the divorce is also crucial to good outcomes for children. So the parenting plan first establishes decision-making authority for major decisions. And in most cases, again, it's joint. And then the other piece of it is the parenting schedule. And so that's how parents divide time with the children. And typically that's done in overnights. So, and if the parents are both fit parents, which in most of the cases we see they are, quite often, almost always, the division will be 50-50. They'll both have equal parenting time. Now, there may be reasons to not have equal parenting time, especially if you have very young children. There may be some period of time where it makes more sense for the child to be with one parent more than the other. But ultimately, that's a negotiation that we go through, and the courts and we in the collaborative process take as the top priority in making those decisions the best interests of the children. So it's not just about what the parents want, but it's what's going to be best for the kids. And so there will be an overnight schedule, and then there'll be a lot of details about how various decisions get made. And then finally, there's the issue of child support, which is an additional form of spousal support on top of alimony or maintenance. And that is determined through a formula based on each parent's income and the number of overnights each parent has with the child and how many children there are. And a couple of other expenses that go into it. Who's paying for health insurance? Do either parent has to pay for child care, for work or education? All of those go into a formula which we can prepare which we do prepare for the parents. And in the end, they come out with a quite detailed document that sets forth how are they going to make decisions, how are they going to split time with the kids, how much child support is there going to be. Those are the major components of it.
Hmm.
And it's helpful to have guidance in that we have a very detailed outline that we provide to parents that just kind of gives you, it's actually quite detailed and just all the things to think about, because it's hard for people to really think about who haven't been through this. What are all the things I should think about? It's like, what are drop-off times and pickup times going to be? How are we going to do vacations? How much vacation time does each of us get? How do we decide those things? How do we decide what gets priority if one parent wants to take a vacation and the other wants to do it at a different time? How do we split up holidays? Those are all important elements that if you get them into an agreement between the parents, then they're not fighting over it.
Hmm.
And what I like to tell parents too is that going forward, things are as flexible as you're able to be collaborative going forward. So what I say is the parenting plan is your fallback for when you can't agree in the future. But if at any point either parent says, hey, you've got this Tuesday night, but I'd really love to have the kids that night because we've got a special event going on, and the other parent says, sure, absolutely, you just do it. You're not bound to follow what you said in the parenting plan. As long as you both agree, you can be as flexible as you want.
Yes, right. So there's some flexibility there. Now, what about in the case where parents can't agree about something? How do you, who kind of makes the decision? How does that work?
Yeah. So in mediation, there are times certainly where parents really struggle to come to agreement on certain issues. And what I've found is, I mean, ultimately, the answer to your question is if they can't agree on pre-divorce, if they can't agree on something that's going to go into the divorce orders, it gets decided by the court. So if you go through mediation and you get to a point where you simply can't come to an agreement, then the mediation ultimately ends, and you can actually have a partial agreement that you take to the court.
Hmm.
You say, well, we agreed on all of these things, but this thing we just can't agree on, and we need the court to decide. And the
Right.
court will decide it.
Hmm.
I can tell you, Gabrielle, that very rarely happens. I have a nearly 100% success rate in terms of getting parents to settlement in these mediations. And the reason for that is once people get into the process and get invested in it, there's a lot at stake, and it's pretty tough to go through all of the process of negotiating and working these things out and then say, no, we just can't do it. Let's take it to the court after all.
Hmm. Hmm.
Um,
That's wonderful to have that kind of success rate. Yeah. Okay, so gosh, there's so much to talk about just around children. And, I'd love to have you back sometime just to kind of focus in on that aspect because I think that is obviously one of the biggest concerns that people have around what is this going to do to my kids? And as you know, a lot of people don't get divorced purely for that reason because they don't want to hurt their children. But I actually want to come back to some other things here because there are some really interesting parts to the collaborative process. Like one of the things you talk about on your website are the rules of engagement, and wondering just about that and how that probably also plays into like who's an appropriate candidate,
mhm.
right? Yeah.
Yes. There's a few things that clearly make people not appropriate candidates. I can talk about those at the outset.
Hmm.
Um, one of them being some of them being something like a mental illness in one of the parents that's severe enough that they really can't be expected to negotiate in an appropriate way. Um, there's then the word narcissist gets thrown around a lot these days, as I'm sure
Yeah.
you hear. I think it's overused, but an extreme level of narcissism, for example, could make a party on, because what you have to have for mediation is two parties who can both negotiate sufficiently for themselves with the help of a skilled mediator and perhaps lawyers in the background.
Hmm.
And there's not a lot of people that fall outside that, Brett. I've worked with people that really have trouble with it, but ultimately can get there because we're good at what we do. We've done a lot of this, and we can really help people to get there. But if someone has a significant mental illness going on, they may not be appropriate. If someone has a severe substance abuse that's being untreated issue going on, that could potentially make them inappropriate for mediation. So anything that would make either party just unable to properly negotiate for themselves. Um, it does require the maturity to, even though, so I want to say this in an appropriate way. I get that when people come to my office, there's often a lot of hurt going on. And it's very common for one party to have made the decision to get divorced and the other party not wanting to get divorced and feeling like the other party is betraying the marriage, is giving up too soon, and feeling a lot of hurt and blame. That alone does not disqualify people from mediating. I deal with that all the time, and I help people with that. But it does require, if someone is just 100% stuck in blame, and they can't get past it enough to be able to set it aside enough to say, what is a fair outcome here? How do I do this in a way that's best for my children? Then ultimately they're not going to be successful in mediation.
Hmm.
But again, I certainly don't want to say to anybody that because they have hurt feelings and they're angry at their spouse, they're not appropriate for mediation. That's absolutely not true. I've helped many couples through mediation who come in with those feelings.
Hmm.
Um, but it does require someone to at least be able to, while holding those feelings, and I hold space for those feelings, and I don't judge them because I understand them.
Yeah.
But while holding space for them, still being able to rationally negotiate. With property, a lot of it's just numbers.
Hmm.
Even though there's a ton of emotion wrapped up in money, I get that, but you do have to come up with it, and holding in mind too that coming up with an agreement that leaves one of the spouses financially bereft is not good for anyone. It's
Right.
certainly not good for the children. And that's why the equity rules exist to a large degree, is to protect children.
Hmm.
Because if a spouse, for example, who hasn't been working for years because the couple made the choice to have one spouse work and the other spouse be a stay-at-home parent, were left with no property, then the children would suffer because they have one parent who's financially devastated.
Right.
And
Right.
so it does require one to put the children's interests ahead of one's feelings at
Hmm.
times.
Hmm.
And I find that almost all parents can do that when push really comes to shove.
Right. I
It's
mean,
really hard sometimes.
yeah, kids are the big guns, right? When people feel like, we can't stand each other anymore, but we have these little munchkins that we need to take care of, and we'll do anything for them.
That's right.
So, yeah, yeah, which can, I'm sure, have really a positive impact on the process as a whole. Like you're saying, we want to make sure that both parents have sufficient means to raise their children.
That's right. That's right. And the people that come to us, I mean, many of the people that come to us get that on a deep level, and that's why they're
Hmm.
looking for collaboration in the first place.
Right.
And then, on the far other side of the bell curve, we have people that don't want to go through traditional divorce, but they're really struggling to keep all that stuff in mind. And I help people with that, and in a very non-judgmental way. Again, I can hold space for those feelings without judging them or blaming parents for having those feelings, but
Yep.
helping them to basically allow their better natures to make the decisions.
Yeah. I think that's so important and really unique in terms of the collaborative process, because I think for a lot of people going through traditional divorce, they feel like they have to sort of leave their feelings at the door. And it's all about the numbers, and it's all a very rational, sort of left brain process. And of course, it's kind of impossible to do that, right? Because it's such an emotional thing by nature. So it's wonderful that you're kind of able to hold that balance for people. Yeah. And
Yeah,
still get it done.
yeah, it's a balance. It is a
Yeah.
balance.
Yeah.
We don't spend all our time sitting around processing feelings because that's your job actually.
Right.
You're really good at that, and I send people to you when they need some of that additional help.
Yes. Thank
Uh,
you.
and so that's not my job. Although I am a trained therapist, I am not doing couples therapy.
Right. Right. Yeah.
Um, but it is a matter of holding space for it.
Mhm.
And I just do want to say one little thing about what you mentioned about traditional divorce. Part of what happens too, on the other side of that, is lawyers will more often than I like to admit, get really caught up in their clients' emotional stories.
Mm.
And then the lawyers end up, in our way of viewing things, there's a reason lawyers are called counselors. It's not because we're doing counseling in the therapy sense, but we're being asked to stay grounded and mature and have a higher perspective when we're working with our clients. So, and our firm does actually provide litigation support as well for parties who can't mediate. But our approach is, the last thing the client needs is for the lawyer to also get caught up in the emotional story and then be going into court and making a bunch of promises that they can't keep. Saying, yeah, you're right. That other parent's a jerk, and we're going to get you 100% parenting time. When they know that's not possible. That's not
Right.
going to happen in a courtroom. And yet they
Hmm.
tell their clients that, they take all their money, they get them into a big fight, and then the outcome is, ends up being 50-50 parenting time after all, except now you've got two parents that hate each other,
Right.
and can't get along and can't co-parent effectively. And the children, again, suffer terribly in those situations.
Hmm.
And so, what people need from their lawyers and from their mediator is to be able to stay grounded while holding space for those very understandable emotions, getting also that those emotions will eventually pass,
Hmm.
if a person is healthy. And when they pass, you don't want to be looking back on the divorce and going, wow, I burned the whole house to the ground at a time when I wasn't rational. And then my lawyer actually helped me to do that. And unfortunately, too often, that's what happens in traditional divorce.
Yeah. Wow. So painful. Yeah. Um, so I'm wondering about, yeah, shifting this conversation. There's so much to talk about here, but one thing I'm really interested in is if you could speak more to sort of the emotional process in terms of the transition from being in a relationship to now we're divorcing, and we have to go through this very complex process of getting divorced, which takes time. We're no longer a couple. And what does that mean for our relationship as a couple if we just sort of take the kids out of it? How do you see the what we need to do as we're going through transition in terms of how we relate to our partner, how we relate to ourselves, and the change in the relationship?
Mm, yeah, that's an excellent question. I think it starts with really giving a lot of care and respect to oneself to start, to acknowledge that going through divorce, as you know well, Gabrielle, it triggers. As adults, we still have, as little babies, we have as part of our survival mechanism and through evolution, attachment, a drive to attachment. To attach to our caregivers, and that's actually built into the deepest roots of our brains, in an appropriate way. And so a break in the attachment relationship between babies and their caregivers can have lifelong terrible consequences for a human being. When we become into adulthood, those attachment impulses actually don't go away, as you know. And in marriage, when a marriage is breaking up, it can trigger feelings that almost can feel like one's survival is at risk. And so people will have anxiety and fear and pain, to the level as if their actual life was being threatened at times. And so it takes some self care, to just acknowledge, to hold space for those feelings, and to say, okay, I can hold space for this, and to get help, and from people like you, and from close friends and people who can really actually hold space for it without stoking the flames of blame and fear.
Hmm.
So starting with self care, and then, being willing to say, this part of the transition process of the divorce, it is the hardest part. I've seen over and over again, when the divorce is over, it starts an immediate shift of just starting to head into healing. But while one is in the process of divorce, it's very provoking and triggering. And so, being holding space for the other as well, just really acknowledging that, yes, this is unavoidably painful, and either me or my spouse at times probably won't be behaving at our best. But having a higher perspective of, I really want to do this in a way that's going to set me up for a better life going forward, and a better life for my children. Because and knowing that I'm going to be in relationship with this person for many years after this
Hmm.
process is over. So, giving yourself whatever boundaries and space you need. Um, Usually that means one of the parties moving out of the house, that where they're living, and knowing that, you know if that's done in a collaborative way, that is not going to impact how the rest of things turn out. People often fear, well, if I move out, that means the court's going to say that the other party gets everything and gets the house and gets the kids. And that's not true.
Hmm.
If someone were to actually just pack up and go in the middle of the night and disappear, then a court might look at that and go, wow, that has me questioning this person's fitness as a parent. But if it's done in a rational way, we've talked about it. It's me that's moving out, but we get that we're going to still divide the house and have equal time with the kids. It's not going to impact how that would turn out, even if it went to a court.
Hmm. Hmm.
So, creating appropriate boundaries, giving each other the space they need to process it. While sometimes people, if conflict is quite high, they really only interact with each other in the mediation process, other than just basic things, logistics that need to be cared for outside of the relationship. Um, I think it's also just really good to keep in mind, again, punishing the other person during the divorce is not going to lead to better outcomes. It's going to lead to worse outcomes. So, despite feeling hurt, getting that, hey, we still are sharing finances, we still need to do that until we get through this, being willing to accept that.
Yep.
If you try to cut the other person off, it's going to look bad.
Hmm.
It's actually only going to hurt your position going forward. So,
Hmm. Hmm.
um,
Yeah.
give, getting support and giving each other space and giving yourself space to begin the healing process and to go through this very provoking process is a big part of it.
Right. And I'm also hearing that another big part of it is that future focus
Yeah.
on where are we heading? What's the end goal here? What's we want to play the long game here. Like we want to come out of this thing right side up. And so having that vision for, we don't want to do this irreparable damage. We need to be together, like as co-parents, that's not going to change. So those types of things, from what you're saying, can lend focus to what we need to do now so that people don't get so kind of lost in the trenches.
That's very well said, and that's absolutely right, and that's something that we really work with people on. We have in our process, we have a voluntary. We encourage people to do it, intention session, which we don't charge extra for. We have people go through several processes. One of which is getting clear on their values, sharing those with each other, getting clear on, and then we going making some commitments as to
Hmm.
how they're going to go through the divorce, how they're going to commit to being parents, co-parents in the future. And one of the things I do with people in that process is take them through a guided meditation, and it involves imagining oneself to be 5, 10 years in the future at a future event when you're all together with the kids. Say one of the kids is graduating from college, and you're putting yourself in that place years down the road and looking back at how you went through this process that you're going through now. And it's a nice exercise to do exactly what you just said, to start stepping into future focus, because it can really be amazing, actually, how the imagination can help to actually imagine, like, I'm in the future now and I'm looking back, and how do I want to see myself? How I handled myself through this very challenging transition. Do I want to look back with regret, or do I want to look back feeling pretty good about how I handled it? And that includes standing up for yourself too. It's not just being nice. It means, do I want to look back and say, I did what was right. I stood up for what I needed, and I didn't burn down the house.
I love that. It's so powerful what you're saying. Such an important tool to think about how we want to see ourselves looking back, right? Yeah. Peter, can you tell us why it is that you do collaborative divorce and mediation? What is it about this that you're so passionate about?
Mm. Well, Thank you for asking that. I actually, that's a good way of putting it. I am passionate about it. And I can say that I wasn't always passionate about being a lawyer. I was a lawyer doing a lot of other things for years and never liked it very much. And in the process of that time, I actually went through my own divorce. And so I am in a second marriage now that's coming up on 10 years and is beyond what I ever thought a marriage could be.
Mm.
And I got into collaborative law because my dissatisfaction with law was around not working with people as directly as I wanted to about on their lives. Like really, what's most important. And when I'm working with people going through the transition of divorce, what I see from my own experience is that it is not only a very challenging thing, and it is indeed a very challenging thing, but it is also an opportunity because it gives one the chance to actually go through something that challenging and put higher values into play, in future focus into play, in seeing how can I do this in a way that benefits myself, but also benefits my children, benefits my family, benefits the world, by me using this to to grow. And so I, through personal experience of having gone through some very challenging things in my life and looking back and coming around to a place where I am now focused on how can I take responsibility for my life? How can I be in service? That's what brought me to being with people when they're going through some of their most challenging times, because that's when they need the support. And I find that almost all the people I see ultimately want to do what's right. And they may be being hurt, feeling hurt, and they may be feeling blaming of another person for their hurt at the moment. But ultimately, they want to do good, and they want to do what's best for them. They want to do what's best for their children. And being able to help people do that is a great honor, and I love it.
Wow, beautiful. What an inspiring message. Yeah, and I also just want to mention your wife, Lori Lazar, who is also doing very powerful work in the world. She's the founder and executive director of the Realness Project, which is a nonprofit that teaches prison inmates how to relate and communicate with others in a way that allows them to truly rehabilitate in prison and to succeed when they are released. So both of you are bringing so much goodness into the world.
Yes, yeah, Thank you for mentioning that. She's very lit up by that work, and it is very powerful work, and I strongly support her, obviously, in doing that. And I just want to mention that the practices she teaches those inmates, they're generally referred to as authentic relating practices. I use those in my work as well, and actually just did a webinar on that, on those practices that I could um, turn your people onto as well if that's useful. But yeah,
Absolutely, we'll put that in the show notes for people. Yeah. Peter, it's been a pleasure having you today. I'm so happy to have this opportunity to speak with you and share this amazing information with the listeners. I think it's just so important that people have an understanding of the fact that there are alternatives to really going through a horrible divorce. So thank
absolutely.
you. Yeah, thank you so much for being here and for all the work that you do. And I want to just mention the websites for people if they would like to get more information about your work and Lori's work. So Peter's website is consciousfamilyfirm.com. His book, again, is called The Collaborative Divorce Advantage, available on Amazon. And Lori's website about her work with inmates is realnessproject.org. We're also going to put the Peter's webinar about authentic relating in the show notes for you. Okay, so thank you again so much, and we'll have you on again.
Well, thank you very much, Gabrielle. I appreciate you having me on, and really highly respect the work that you do with couples as well. It's really amazing work.
Thank you. Okay, take care.
You too.